Hello and welcome to this video on electrolytes. These are ubiquitous inclusions in energy drinks, sports drinks, and even some gamer drinks. Electrolytes can be found in solutions intended to compensate for vomiting horrendously or explosive diarrhea and other rituals in observance of the porcelain throne. Despite being used widely, just what are electrolytes, how do they help, and why are they important? Let's start with what electrolytes are, as this is perhaps the simplest question to answer. Electrolytes are one of many different ions, and in some cases single elements, from the periodic table that carry a small charge. Think of table salt or sodium chloride. It is made from two ions in the end, sodium and chlorine. When they enter the body, the bond between them is broken by the change in isoelectric charge and the fact that they are in an aqueous solution. Each of these then becomes an ion, or in this case, an electrolyte. Sodium is an ion with one free charge. Chlorine is a slightly different ion as it is short one charge. As these ions are somewhat charged with an up to -4 and up to +4 rating, they are either negatively or positively biased. This means they can conduct electricity. Further to just being a means of carrying current, electrolytes can be a means of maintaining pH in the body. Both acid and alkali substances require the balanced use of ions. As you shift the hydrogen on or off a substance, that is because it has the either free or lack of free openings, this being the ion with a +1 or -1 and up to +1 and -4 charge, similar to a D&D character's equipment. When you have a hydrogen that leaves a positive molecule, it drops its number. Or if it gains a hydrogen, its number goes closer to 0, so a -4 will go down to -3, and a +4 will go down to a +3. This is essential as the hydrogens jumping on or off acidic or alkali molecules is essential to prevent your body from wildly swinging between pH like a drunk on their way out of a bar. Ions, and more accurately buffers, compensate for this jumping of hydrogens. They keep the pH in a much more narrow range by providing the free hydrogen ions to either add to or take away as needed. This ensures that all of your ions constantly remain in motion around the body as needed. They don't have to worry about being interfered with by excess or unneeded hydrogen. But they can play that role, so it's worth keeping in mind. Not only are electrolytes there to provide other physiological functions, but they also act as a sort of buffer. This now tells us to some extent what an electrolyte is, but does not explain what it does. More importantly, it doesn't explain why something called Pocari Sweat is popular, given it sounds like you are drinking someone's sweat. On second thought, we don't want to know what it is that makes the notion of drinking someone's sweat appealing.
Let me put it this way, Eddie. The possibilities of Tiberium are limitless.
The role that electrolytes play in the human body is almost limitless. Not as limitless as Tiberium, but still close. For this video, we will go over some of the major reasons for what it does and how it does it. The most common electrolytes in the human body are going to be your sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chlorine, hydrogen phosphates, hydrogen carbonates, and to a certain extent a few other trace minerals that are going to show up in various ways. Importantly for what we're going to talk about, the first and most obvious is sodium, because you have sodium and generally glucose or some other basic sugar is what's present in most electrolyte beverages. Sodium is what's doing most of the work there, and not for lack of others being active, just that this is the big player for what we're going to talk about. The sodium is in the extracellular fluid, and that is the fluid around the cells. And in some instances, for example with neurons, potassium is inside the cell. When both of these are moving freely, you get the free movement of water, which is ideal. You certainly want that to some extent. This ensures nutrients enter cells and waste material leaves the cell. When you don't have them in balance, you now have a problem, as fluid movement, and notably water with whatever's in it, whether it is nutrients or waste, tends to get built up on one side of the membrane or the other. In this case, If you don't have enough of your electrolyte solution in your plasma or blood, all of the content inside the cell will start coming out because the cell is having to move the electrolytes within it outside to try and maintain fluid balance. However, that also means that you don't get movement of nutrients and other similar good things into the cell, as they don't have the movement of water to support that. This will lead to an alteration in blood pressure but also cellular function. Obviously, cells working properly is generally desirable in most situations. This is also why multicellular life is not only complex, but it requires a very complex balance between intracellular and extracellular ions, and in this instance electrolytes. Without the right balance, you get osmotic pressure building up in one side or the other of the membrane, and this completely stuffs up the gradient. If the gradient doesn't work properly, you don't get proper regulation of many things that go on in the body. Blood pH is a significant example, but another which may not occur to most people is actually your nerve function. In order for nerves to work properly, they need electrolytes to be in the right concentrations on the right side of the membrane. If you don't have enough sodium or potassium on each side of the neuron membrane, it can't do what it needs to do, and most importantly, that is action potentials. If you can't propagate an action potential down a neuron, you can't get an effect at the end. If you don't have an effect at the end, you can't have things like beating of the heart, contraction of muscles to be able to move, or importantly, drink an electrolyte solution, or run away from threats, and so on. The reason why most of the time this isn't an issue, at least in terms of physiology, is that most of these are controlled through very specialized and dedicated ion channels. These prevent your body from letting excess sodium or potassium in and out of the neuron at the wrong time. If this doesn't happen, you're going to find yourself in a world of trouble, largely because the movement of these molecules would lead to neurons firing spontaneously and unpredictably. For most people, this is known as a seizure. It also means that you would have things like tics. Uncontrolled activity, dedicated ion channels prevent that from happening unless it's wanted and needed in a given time, way, and place. This leads us to what happens when your body is short of electrolytes and how you get that way. The most common means are going to be strenuous physical activity. Not that kind, the other kind. Get your mind out of the gutter, you filthy degenerate. Things like sports, hard work, and similar. All of these are the kind of strenuous physical activity we're talking about. All of these can cause you to lose electrolytes, for example through sweat, and to a lesser extent urination. The same thing occurs when you are sick. The only notable difference is that a lot of the electrolytes are lost either through your mouth or arse, rather than through sweat or urination. That is to say, in the case of illness, it's vomiting or diarrhea. The fluid you expel from your body, whether that is through sweat, vomit, diarrhea, or urine, are filled with electrolytes as they are used to draw water into the lumen of your stomach, anus, or, in instance of your kidneys, the renal system. This allows your body to make more fluid which it can expel. Generally speaking, this is a result of increased blood pressure for the renal system, illness for vomiting and diarrhea, or sweat due to physical activity and the need to have water available for sweat to be generated. Either way, it leads to your body gradually but surely losing electrolytes that cannot be recovered or compensated for. That is because those electrolytes are used for the osmotic effect and drawing water out of the rest of the body. It is also why you need exogenous or from outside your body electrolytes. This is most frequently through oral means. The oral means can be pre-made electrolyte solutions or as a tablet you swallow. In extreme cases, it may be intravenous or by having an IV line or cannula put in you and the electrolytes directly pumped into your body. This latter situation only happens when things have gone very wrong. Almost as wrong as the decision by a token character in a horror movie to go exploring on their own. In oral rehydration therapy, electrolyte drinks containing sodium and potassium generally are what are needed, and these help to replenish the body's ions, and electrolytes specifically in this case. They're often used to supplement your electrolytes due to dehydration caused by all manner of issues. The most obvious are going to be things like physical activity, but also due to illness. As a general rule, the biggest issue with a lack of electrolytes is twofold. One is that if you then consume water without electrolytes, you're going to experience something called hyponatremia, which is effectively too much water and too few electrolytes. The second issue is that all of the things in your body that rely on electrolytes are no longer have them available and start to fail. There's also another much more, memorable experience with this, which is for most people a hangover. A hangover is exactly the same phenomena, it's just caused by being drunk initially, and the various effects that come from that. You can very simply make a DIY or homemade version of electrolyte solutions by using roughly equal amounts of sugar and salt. You then dissolve these in water, and that has much the same effect, although it is somewhat distinct from commercial preparations, as they generally contain a range of extra material that's also useful, rather than just being sodium and chlorine along with a little bit of glucose. The, DIY version is a simple ratio of 1:1 for sugar and salt, and the reason why you use a 1:1 ratio is that cells actually need sodium to be able to absorb sugar, or more accurately, for these sugars, and notably glucose, to pass through the glucose transporters and into the inside of the cell. The sodium is also useful in a variety of ways for neurons that need it not only as a way of passing on the action potential, but also to ensure that the body balances all sorts of other elements, let's say. But the sugar itself also allows the body to, continue doing what it needs to do. Once you begin to be rehydrated, your body's going to need this for a range of features. We already mentioned the essential nature of this for the neurosystem. But what else electrolytes do in the body can be kind of, if not more important, in terms of, emergency needs, rather than simply maintaining someone's health due to physical activity or illness. When you have a hydration fluid brought into your body, generally through oral administration, the fluid itself is isoosmotic, that is, it has roughly the same osmolarity, or force of the water pulling in and pushing out, as blood already has. It's roughly equal with what your, more accurately plasma rather than blood, is capable of holding, and that's important, as it means you're not going to pull water into the intestinal tract, nor are you going to be forcing an excessive amount into the bloodstream immediately. Rather, it's going to more gradually but reliably diffuse into the bloodstream. This is going to be more difficult to achieve, not just because, everybody's different, but rather it's because the exact osmolarity needs to be fairly narrowly tailored. Fortunately, most commercial preparations achieve this to the most part, and it's by using the right amount of sodium. The sodium then prevents the amount that's put back into the intestine from being outweighed by the amount that's already in there. If that was the case, you'll be drawing all the water from the blood vessels around the intestine inside the intestine to try and effectively dilute it out. In the case of extreme diarrhea, it may be necessary to go with even less sodium inside the hydration fluid, and that's because the amount of fluid being absorbed into the intestine in an effort to expel the pathogen is excessive, and so if you have too much sodium in there, you're going to only make that worse. This leads to what happens once the sodium gets into your intestine, more specifically the small intestine. When it passes by dedicated cells, it's going to be absorbed, and these cells are going to pick it up and then try and pass it through the intestinal wall and into the bloodstream. This is done in part by those glucose transporters. The glucose or sugar within the solution activates them, and they sit there and go, oh, there's a source of sugar available, quickly pump it into the cell. in order to pump it into the cell, it has to have sodium available. So this means it always passes through with a certain amount of sugar. This then gets handled by the cell itself in the case of some glucose. The remaining glucose is handled by the liver later on. For the purposes of sodium, the sodium can be sent on into the bloodstream, or it can instead be pumped back into the lumen or inside of the intestine by sodium-potassium pumps. Remember that whole thing about having to have the right electrolytes in the right places? This is an example of that. If you don't have the right amount of sodium and potassium on each side of the membrane, the pump can't work. And that's because that pump relies on what is effectively a sort of equivalent exchange, if you will. So many units of potassium come in, so many units of sodium go out. This is generally always a 3:2 ratio. That is, 3 sodium ions for 2 potassium ions. This creates a gradient, and it's why you're able to continuously bring more sodium back into the cells. Because technically you're not bringing in more sodium, you're bringing in the same sodium that's being expelled through a different pathway. If you don't have adequate sodium on one side of the membrane, you are unable to bring glucose across, and that's simply because you need 2 sodium ions, or electrolytes, for every 1 molecule of glucose. If you don't have sodium, you can't absorb glucose, and this is an issue, and it's why you need, well, amongst other things, electrolytes, but particularly the right balance of them on the right sides of the membrane. Further to that, if you were not to, let's say, expel the sodium from inside the cell, you have a more immediate and significant issue. That is osmosis. Osmosis is the net movement of water along a gradient, and in this case, the water is following the concentration of electrolytes, sodium specifically. If you have a buildup of sodium inside a cell, the water is going to follow this into the cell, and it will keep following it. There is no way to necessarily stop it from moving. If you don't stop it from moving into the cell, it will keep building up, and eventually become overhydrated. This can, if things get extremely bad, lead to lysis of the cell, which will eventually lead to intestinal damage. This is why the intestines cycle through the necessary sodium, partly to expel it because you don't want it continuously building up, but also to ensure that water follows through into the cell. That is to say, when you are drinking something like an electrolyte solution, the reason it can rehydrate you, even though you can still be either extremely fatigued from sports or still be violently ill, either vomiting or diarrhea, is that the movement of the sodium and glucose through those transporters carries with it a certain amount of water. That small amount of water may not be much individually, but considering that you are consuming hundreds upon thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of individual ions, and every 2 of those ions of sodium can carry 1 unit of glucose across the membrane, and every time they carry that glucose across the membrane, they bring with them hundreds of molecules of water, you are able to move a relatively large quantity of water across the membrane and into the bloodstream, even though it may be true that elsewhere in your body, some of that water is being drawn out in order to, well, facilitate the body's diarrhea or sweat. This is what electrolytes are, and hopefully a clearer idea as to why they are important. It should also demonstrate why it is electrolytes in many drinks are honestly nothing more than marketing bullshit. It will do nothing for you unless you have been physically active, sick, or otherwise in need of both fluids and electrolytes. That is because your body will simply dispose of what it doesn't need. For instance, excess sodium will simply be shuffled back into the lumen of the intestine and you will poop it away, or in some instances, you may have to deal with it via the renal system, but the same end result occurs. Your body gains nothing from having consumed it. Same thing with the excess fluids, except they are generally explicitly handled, well, through the renal system rather than as feces. Well, different kind of feces. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.